Hi, Kanji. Welcome back. Thanks for coming back on.
Hey Jake, thanks for having me. It's great to be back with you.
Yeah. So for this one, I was interested in exploring, like I said, just the Zen tradition, the philosophy, and then the practices around it, because I think it's sometimes it's like it's kind of mysterious and fun to explore because it's so much less in some ways concrete than some of the other traditions, which is part of what I really like about it. So I guess to start off, if you had to, how would you first try to describe or explain Zen roughly?
Yeah, great question. I think the best way to describe it is it's really about life. Now that sounds very broad, and I don't mean it to be abstract either, but it's really about how we live our lives. And so I think there's a common misconception that Zen is strictly a relaxation technique. It's something that you can use to calm down and just chill out. And something I say occasionally to people is if all you want to do is relax, just lie in a hammock with a margarita. You
Yeah.
know, that's a good way to relax. Zen is much deeper than that. It's a way to, as I say, to live, but in a way that's fully engaged. The traditional explanation that was given by a semi-legendary figure from India in 6th century China was that it's a direct pointing to the mind. And so when we're directly experiencing mind, we're also directly experiencing life, and I can talk more about that. But so so to be fully engaged moment by moment in what's arising with direct taste, direct contact, and Zen basically has three modes of operation. One is the meditation practice, which most people are familiar with. Actually, the word Zen means meditation. It comes from the Sanskrit jhana, which was transmuted into Chinese as Chan, and when it arrived in Japan, it was rendered as Zen. So the meditation practice is really the heart of it. Unlike a lot of other Buddhisms where meditation might be more or less peripheral, it's really the heart of the practice. And then there's also the koan work. These are paradoxical stories that are meant to plunge the mind instantly into a state of not knowing, which isn't ignorance, but it's a mind that's free of preconceptions, and so it's a fresh mind. And then also the ethical precepts. So all of these taken together in Zen practice really give us a template for living our lives in a way that's really sane and balanced and responsible.
So would training usually follow that sequence, like in the order of those components that you mentioned? So meditation, koans, and ethical precepts. Would it usually be kind of a step by step path like that, or are all three of them being worked on at once?
Well, that's a good question as well because it varies from center to center. So because the meditation practice is central, that would often be highlighted first. And as a student progresses through the meditation training, that student then would possibly be interested in inquiring into the koan training. Not all Zen practitioners do koan training. Traditionally, there are two schools of Zen, Soto and Rinzai. We don't need to get into the technicalities here, but not all Zen practitioners practice koan, but I find it extremely valuable. It's a way to get a direct experience of the nature of reality. And so it could go from meditation to koan, or it might just remain with the koan. The ethical precepts are often foregrounded, particularly in American Buddhism. In Asian Buddhism, they tend to come later, but because they're so important, we tend to consider them to be foundational here. So I won't name all 10 of the grave precepts, but not killing, not stealing, and so on, are guidelines, not commandments, but guidelines for dealing with the messy realities of life as they arise. And then we can work with them by holding the literal view and the oneness view and the compassionate view of each of these precepts.
Yeah, how do you view the difference between guidelines and commandments?
Well, the guidelines are more flexible and they give us a certain amount of freedom for responding skillfully to what's arising that allows for the complexities in life. The commandments that come to us out of the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is what I was raised in, like most people that I'm familiar with in the Buddhist world in America, are stricter in their interpretation, and they're given to us essentially as laws that have to be obeyed. The precepts function as guidelines in that sometimes we have to make hard choices, and they're not always clear. So I'll give you an example from my own life. From the year 2017, when my younger brother was in the intensive care unit in the hospital, and he had suffered a brain aneurysm, and there was no way that he was ever going to emerge from that. And so after several weeks, we had to make the really difficult decision to turn off the life support. In doing that, we were violating the literal guideline of the precept of not killing, of not taking life. But we were also honoring the compassionate view because we considered that to be the most merciful course of action. So these guidelines give us some freedom and flexibility in dealing with what's arising in our lives.
So
I was just going to say, inevitably we may make some mistakes as well.
Mhm.
When we do, then we can atone and do whatever we need to do to make restitution or to correct the mistake we made.
Yeah. Yeah, in Christianity, my understanding is that the commandments are thought to have they're coming from God as rules for how to live, and if you break those, there will be consequences, and if you follow along with them, you will be rewarded for that by this an external creator. It's like it sounds a little bit more like cosmically handed down than some of the Buddhist guidelines are. How are the guidelines in Buddhism established, and like what's the perspective of what they're aiming for, and I guess what they're aiming to accomplish as opposed to the commandments in Christianity?
Right, right. So the commandments in Christianity, as we're told, were given to Moses as tablets on Mount Sinai by God, exactly as you were describing. The precepts in Zen Buddhism derive over time, if we trace it back far enough, to what are called the Vinaya, which are the monastic regulations in ancient India. And followers of the Buddha way were attempting to live communally in monasteries. And this was, in many ways, an unprecedented experiment. And so they were devising ways to live in harmony together. In very practical guidelines, the regulations for the monks and then the nuns were designed to give people a template for living together in ways that honored the sacred endeavor that they were engaged in, but also to ensure that everybody was functioning as a community. So they weren't they weren't delivered from a cosmic deity. They were developed basically from the ground up and modified as needed. And then over time, these monastic codes of the Vinaya, as Buddhism migrated in various directions along the Silk Road and along the Sea Route, were adapted in the new communities in Southeast Asia and China and Japan according to those cultural norms. And so what we find in Zen Buddhism and Chan being the Chinese precursor to Japanese Zen, are these ethical guidelines that give us a basic pathway for living a life of wisdom and compassion.
Yeah, so it's about just establishing some general principles for, whenever we live this way, our communities tend to thrive and reduce as much unnecessary suffering as much as possible.
That's right. Yeah, that's a good way to say it.
I find the origins of this interesting. I know there's questions. It seems like this is kind of across the board with a lot of these traditions. There's questions as to, how this tradition started and split off from other Buddhist lineages. What do you think happened there? Like, how do you think this developed?
Well, it's fascinating, I think, because as Mahayana Buddhism, and some of your listeners may be interested to know, there are basically what are called three vehicles in Buddhism. So there's the Theravada, which is sometimes called the Nikaya, the Path of the Elders, which geographically, of course, emerged from India, but geographically tends to be located in Southeast Asia. Mahayana Buddhism, which emerged from it about the beginning of the Common Era, and geographically tends to be associated with China, Japan, Korea. And then Vajrayana, the diamond vehicle, which emerged from that in Tibet. And all three of those are here in the United States now. So as this migration occurred, as Mahayana Buddhism moved from India to China, an interesting transformation took place, and this hybrid form of Buddhism gradually emerged in China, in which Mahayana Buddhism connected with the native Confucianism and Taoism. And Confucianism in China basically was a social system for ensuring hierarchy and order and harmony, both at the family level and all the way up to the governmental level. And then Taoism was and still is the practice that's described in the Tao Te Ching of the natural order of things and being in the flow and being in harmony with the natural order. Both of these, when they came together with Mahayana Buddhism from India, helped to create an entirely new way of practice, an entirely new way of living that in some ways is so different from Indian Buddhism that it constitutes a completely new development. And so Chan in China developed directly out of this merger of Confucianism and Taoism with Mahayana Buddhism from India, and then Zen adapted that.
And could you explain the idea of the Bodhisattva, and if that continued from Mahayana? I think that's where that's from through Zen. Has that remained stable across Zen and the different areas that it's gone to? And could you explain that concept?
Sure. Yeah, it absolutely has remained stable. And the concept of the Bodhisattva emerged out of Indian Mahayana Buddhism, and it was part of the revolutionary reformation that was taking place within Buddhism. The critique of Mahayana Buddhism, Mahayana means great vehicle, so it's a self-proclaimed great vehicle in contrast to what preceded it. So part of the argument, the revolutionary argument that Mahayana Buddhism was making was that the Buddhism that preceded it, which it designated as the Hinayana, the lesser vehicle, when we no longer use that derogatory term, but they considered it to be lesser in part because they considered it to be self-motivated and to be self-aggrandizing, in the sense that the monks who were practicing it were focused on becoming what were called arhats, who were aspiring to be released from the endless round of existences. And so there's this miserable round of reincarnations that when we are finally liberated from, there's no return. The Bodhisattva, in contrast, was a different sort of ideal. It was a person who is highly spiritually adept and who postpones his or her or their final liberation until all beings are freed of suffering. And so it really fundamentally changed the point of view of what this practice is engaged in. And to address your question specifically, it has carried through, and it's very, very much a central operative feature of Zen Buddhism today, the Bodhisattva ideal of saving all beings. And just to say too, as a sideline, this too was part of the transformation that took place when Mahayana Buddhism from India encountered the cultural traditions of China, because this notion that life on earth is a miserable round of reincarnational existences that we need to be liberated from is a distinctly Indian idea that was very foreign to Chinese culture. So in Chan and in Zen, we don't see that emphasis. It's more about really being in the moment and really being fully engaged with life as it is.
Yeah. Is that position seems it seems sort of pessimistic, and it seems like Zen isn't, like, doesn't quite hold that view that's as negative on life. Are they talking about like physical life, or is that a mental process that they're talking about with this miserable cycle? Because it seems like I guess depending on the lineage, I guess all of them in general, they don't seem to, at least to me from the outside, to have this perspective that life is that brutal. Is that kind of like, am I misinterpreting how that phrase sounds?
No, you're not misinterpreting it. And what we're looking at here, right in the moment, in regard to your question, is the distinction between circumstances in ancient India and ancient Buddhism and contemporary. So if we go back and look at a lot of the ancient Indian Buddhist sutras, there's emphasis on this miserable round of suffering. And in fact, the first noble truth is life is suffering. And then, of course, that's nuanced by saying a life of self-centered craving creates suffering, and so on. But the focus clearly is on suffering and release from suffering, and then the Noble Eightfold Path gives us a means for doing that. And so it's both mental and physical, to address your question. But I think you're right that in a lot of contemporary Buddhisms, especially in the West, the emphasis on the miserable round of reincarnational existences is de-emphasized. And in fact, a lot of American Buddhists are either skeptical about reincarnation to begin with, or aren't interested in addressing it. It doesn't fit our scientific, rationalistic, materialistic Western view. So it doesn't really come up that often. At least in Western convert communities. In ethnic-oriented Western communities, of course, it's different.
Yeah. Is it always viewed as being literal, or do some schools of thought view it as figurative?
The reincarnation?
Mm-hmm.
Good question. I think it depends on who we're looking at. Originally, it was very much considered to be literal.
Yeah.
And in many of the Tibetan Buddhist schools, it's very literal, and it's taken very seriously. So it's not simply figurative. But we can look at it figuratively. I mean, in a certain sense, we're reincarnating all the time, moment by moment. We're not the same person a moment ago that we are now. But the various approaches, I think, are interesting. And for myself, I tend to be an agnostic about reincarnation, but I think it's a fascinating possibility. And I know for myself, I feel profound affinities for certain historical periods. And it's interesting to speculate that it might be due to past life experiences. I also tend to think that if that is true, it's not so much that these lifetimes would occur within our temporal sense of linear time, but that they might be occurring simultaneously within an eternal present, within different dimensions of coexistent reality.
Yeah. Well, what is the Zen perspective on how that view came to be and how we came to be aware of that idea?
How we became aware of the idea of reincarnation?
Yeah, like
in the Zen perspective?
Yeah, where do they think that came from?
Yeah, this has cultural influences as well, because in Zen in Japan, there's a lot of eclecticism, and also in China too, we see ancestor worship and filial piety playing into this. So there are different forms of Buddhism in Japan. Pure Land Buddhism has a form that postulates something that to Christians in the West seems a lot like a heavenly paradise after death. So, but for Zen, reincarnation sort of just hovers in the historical background of the tradition, because Zen is really so much concerned with life right here and now, right here in the present. So what happens to us after death, whether it's reincarnational or otherwise, is considered just an abstract speculation, and it's pointless. It takes us away from the immediate taste of this moment.
So in Zen meditation, you touched on that some earlier. What is the primary thing that you're aiming to get in contact with when you're sitting and doing meditation, and when you're approaching some of the details in terms of posture and how long, and just there seems to be a lot of different, like I said, details about what's the best way to do it. Like what is all that trying to get you aligned with?
Yeah, well, so there are several different ways to be sitting in meditation in Chan or Zen training, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But the important thing to convey is that in sitting in meditation, there's nothing to get, there's nothing to gain. One of the supreme teachers in the Zen Buddhist tradition is somebody named Dogen, who brought the Soto Zen school to Japan from China in the 13th century. And one of the things that he emphasized was, we don't sit on the cushion in order to awaken, but rather because we're awakened, we sit on the cushion. And so what he's pointing to is that we each have original Buddha nature. We're born with complete, perfect clarity, wisdom, and compassion. Now, over time, because of social conditioning, that gets overlaid with all kinds of neuroses. But fundamentally, we all have Buddha nature, and because of that, we sit on the cushion, and when the conditioning drops away, then we're purely present. We're right here, right now. What Bodhidharma, who I referred to at the beginning of our conversation, called direct pointing to the mind. So nothing to get, nothing to gain. And sitting on the cushion, the technique, sometimes people in the Zen tradition will count their breath, counting up to 10 breaths and starting over. And when a thought intrudes, stopping there and starting the counting cycle over again. It's not a technique that I recommend, because I think it tends to be goal-oriented for a lot of people in our society. So what I practice and what I teach is what's called shikantaza, or just sitting. And so the technique is very, very simple. It's sitting upright. It doesn't necessarily have to be on a cushion. It can be on a chair. but sitting upright to facilitate breathing down into the lower belly, which in Japanese is called the hara, and that's the energy center. So breathing down and looking downward in a softly focused, open-eyed gaze, and putting the hands in the traditional mudra is the left palm and the right palm, with the thumbs comprising an ovoid position, and putting those below the navel. And then if you're on the cushion, ideally sitting in a lotus or semi-lotus cross-legged position. There are also some other positions to sit in. The main thing is to be grounded and to be with the breath. And it's such a simple process. Anybody can do it. There's no way to mess it up. There's no way to be a bad meditator. You just stay with the breath, and as you're staying with the breath, thoughts will naturally arise. And that's fine. That's what the brain does. It generates thought. But instead of letting those thoughts run away with us, as we commonly do, we simply note them and let them go and return to the breath. It's so easy to do. And the thoughts will naturally keep coming up, but over time there will be more and more silence and spaciousness between those thoughts. And so that helps us to cultivate that inner space of silence. And from that inner space of silence, then we can begin to live the precepts in a way that is responsive rather than reactive. We have this ability to be skillful with what's arising. And we have the ability to have this open space of mind that the koan training also helps to facilitate. So these all intermesh and work together.
How influential is the eye gaze as opposed to closed-eyed and the mudra?
Well, it's interesting to play an experiment with the open eye and the closed eye gaze. In my experience, the closed eye gaze, not surprisingly, helps to facilitate more interiority, so more looking inward. And the open-eyed, soft downward gaze gives you more of a peripheral sense of ambient spaciousness, because not only are you aware of the space immediately around you, but you're also not closing out sounds. It's not going into some kind of trance-like state that is disembodied. In fact, meditation practice is fully embodied. The body is considered to be the seat of awakening. So again, in some of the ancient Indian Buddhisms, there's a tendency to view the body, the physical body, as corrupt, as vile, as impermanent, as something to shed. Again, when this tradition came to China, that was a very foreign idea that was not embraced, and when it got to Japan as well, the emphasis is on what Dogen called the body-mind, because mind and body are fully integrated. And we know this scientifically now, that at the cellular level there's a deep intelligence. So the fully integrated body-mind is the seat of awakening. And so to play with the open-eyed gaze or the closed-eyed gaze and just, see how it affects that. The breathing, that goes back to very ancient yogic traditions. I know you have some experience with that. So, the breath in the Indian tradition is prana. In the Chinese tradition, it's qi. In Japanese, it's ki. This life force of breath is fundamental to our to the health of the body mind. So using that as central opens up those channels for this life force, but it also gives us a basis, a foundation that's with us all the time. So you don't have to be in a temple or in a zendo sitting on a cushion to do this practice. I mean, you can do it while you're driving a car because you're fully alert. That's what you're doing. In fact, if everybody meditated while they were driving cars, there would be no accidents, because nobody would be daydreaming, nobody would be texting, nobody would be distracted. You're fully there in the moment. So, because we take our breath with us everywhere, we can do this anytime and any place.
What about the mudras?
Oh, the mudra, right. Yeah, you asked about the mudra. So there are different mudras in different Buddhisms that traditionally are considered to generate power, generate energy. And this particular mudra gives a sense of wholeness and cosmic completeness. And so there's that central vacancy, this emptiness, and then there's the form.
Yeah.
And one of the we put that down at the navel, at that energy center of the body mind. And so in one of the sutras or scriptures that's chanted in Zen centers everywhere, called the Heart Sutra, the emphasis is on conveying that form is emptiness, emptiness is form, and so we see that replicated in that mudra. Just as an aside, that particular assertion that form is emptiness, emptiness is form, which is fundamental to both Chan and Zen, is something that also comes out of that Taoist cosmology that Chan emerged from. And in the Taoist cosmology, the Tao, as we were saying earlier, the natural way of flow of harmony, is a Tao both of cosmos and consciousness. So they come together. And Tao sometimes is also referred to as dark enigma. And there's a spontaneous generation, which in Chinese is called Wu Wei. The spontaneous generation of constant process of absenting and presenting, of undifferentiating and differentiating in the world, in the universe, of receding and of emerging, of emptying and forming. And in fact, I like to refer to emptying and forming as active verbs rather than emptiness and form. And then, so this constant process, this absenting, this undifferentiating, this receding and emptying is what we experience in meditation as no self. It's when the ego self and all of its chatter and preoccupations can subside temporarily and abate, so that we're experiencing that vast silence that often is, excuse me, conveyed in an image as sky. And at the same time, we hold this process of presenting and differentiating and emerging and forming, which is often symbolized through the images of mountains and rivers. We hold them both because emptying is forming, forming is emptying. And this is all functioning by an inner pattern of innate order, and it's all suffused with chi life energy. So the point of this being that when we're sitting in meditation, we're experiencing directly this Taoist cosmology of the emptying and the forming, the thought processes, the thoughts, perceptions, sensations, all of that emptying out into silence and then re-emerging into form, from no self to self, from self to no self, all the time.
Yeah, so it's not only just, it's obviously not only just a comfortable and way to sit to keep you alert, but it's also highly symbolic and a reminder of some of the things that you've been taught while you're training this focus.
Exactly. Not only that, but it's a direct embodiment of it. It's directly embodying that experience. So it's not abstract at all, and it's not, excuse me, it's not going into some quiescent, transcendent state of, transcending the world and completely shutting down. It's just the opposite. It's being totally awake. That's what enlightenment means. That's what the word Buddha means. It means awake. So to be totally awake to everything, to really fully live your life, which takes us back to what I said at the outset. When you asked me, what is Zen? I said, Zen is life. It's fully living your life, being awake to your life. And, I'll tell you, most people in our society, I'm not saying this pejoratively, I'm not saying this judgmentally, it's an observation, but most people in our society are sleepwalking through their lives. They're distracted by the phones in their hands. They're distracted by a million things. They're sleepwalking through their lives, and they're missing this incredible wonder and miracle of being alive right here, right now. And so the Zen practice is about waking us up, waking us up. Don't sleepwalk through your life. Wake up. Be here. This is amazing. Experience it.
Yeah. Do you notice that it's helpful with the gaze in interacting with life after you get up from the cushion as opposed to having your eyes closed? Because if your eyes are closed, it's like you're almost completely distanced from everything else. And then when you come out of the meditation, maybe the timer goes off and you get up, then you have like all these new sensory experiences, and maybe sometimes that can kind of pop you out of that state or be disorienting a little bit, as opposed to if you have that peripheral awareness of the things that are around you. When you get up, it's like, yeah, I've been here the whole time. Like, this isn't really anything new. And maybe it's a little bit easier to stay in that state when you're not like all of a sudden distracted by all of these sensory experiences that you had blocked out.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that can happen. And so there's that, transitional bridge between the experiences, excuse me, if it's emerging from a closed-eyed meditation. But there can be value in that as well, in learning how to disengage from that interiority and that quiescent stage to reemerge. Again, it's this process of from the absenting to the presenting. And so to learn how to navigate that. But I think you're right. Probably the downward focus, open-eyed gaze facilitates that a little more rapidly.
Yes. So do you use those two methods as tools on a regular basis? Like, sometimes you approach it as in like, now I mostly want to go inwards and I'll close my eyes, or is it mostly that you stick with the soft gaze because that's what you prefer the most?
I generally stay with the soft gaze. I've used the closed-eyed gaze occasionally, and I think there's certainly value in it, and some people do prefer it. But in the Chan and Zen tradition, the Shikantaza method is to do the softly focused downward gaze. So that's generally what I use.
How is scripture and teaching doctrine, like the concepts that you were talking about a little bit earlier, how's that approached?
Well, that's a great question, because Zen is said to be a direct transmission outside of the scriptures. According to the legends passed down about Bodhidharma, when he arrived in China from India in the 5th century, he was queried by the emperor, what is this practice that you're bringing to us? And Bodhidharma basically said it's a transmission outside of the scriptures, again, direct experience of the nature of mind. So that's one of the things that distinguishes Chan and Zen, is that there's relatively little emphasis on scriptural tradition. So that's quite distinct from many of the other Buddhist schools. And which isn't to say that there aren't some foundational texts, some scriptures that have been very influential historically in the development of Chan and Zen. So, the Lankavatara Sutra, the Platform Sutra, the Heart Sutra I mentioned earlier, the Vimalakirti Sutra, some of these scriptures, and I'm just rattling off the titles. I mean, I know to a lot of your listeners it'll be meaningless without context, but just to say that there are some foundational scriptural texts. But having said that, the primary emphasis is always on direct experience. Chan and Zen are experiential. So it's not about reading scriptures. It's about the lived experience of being in the world, and the literature within the Chan and Zen tradition that is highlighted is generally the koan literature. So there's this very rich compendium of these little paradoxical stories regarding monks and nuns and teachers and students that are designed to break us immediately out of the discursive intellect and analytical thinking into this place of, I have no idea what this means, and it's an amazing spiritual technique. One of the koans, one of the one-liners, as opposed to a story, that many people have heard because it sort of has been mainstreamed into popular culture is what is the sound of one hand clapping? And it's a bit of an unwieldy translation. It's actually more, you know, the sound of two hands clapping. What is the sound of one hand? But even so, it gives you a flavor of what these are designed to do. So the koan literature is very central compared to the scriptural tradition. There's very, very little training in scripture in Chan and Zen, even though there will be in Dharma talks, there might be references to some of these foundational scriptural texts that I mentioned.
So in reading the sutras, is that mostly just a reminder, or like something just to kind of help keep you in the state, or something that just feels good to read, similar to like being around somebody in a certain state that helps you be in that same state as well? Is it more like that, just kind of like surrounding yourself with influences rather than absorbing intellectual concepts?
I think it's more surrounding yourself with influences rather than absorbing intellectual concepts. Yeah. What I find interesting in those early foundational texts that influence Chan and Zen is the aha moments of, oh, now I see where this came from. So, for example, in the Lankavatara Sutra, which is a dialogue ostensibly between the Buddha and somebody who's asking him a lot of questions, and this assertion that the world as we experience is actually a projection of mind, which we know now from neuroscience. I mean, we know that what we take for reality is a construct of our particular human sensory apparatus, which doesn't mean it doesn't exist. We're not hallucinating this. It is actual, but it's not the ultimate reality. Similarly, what we consider to be stable and permanent, if we examine it closely at deeper and deeper levels, we see that it's comprised of atoms. The atoms are comprised of subatomic particles and space, and then ultimately of pulses of energy and space. So this assertion that reality as we experience it is a projection of mind, which is confirmed by contemporary epistemologies and neuroscience. Go back to the Lankavatara Sutra, and it's, wow, 2,000 years ago, they were already asserting this. So it's like, oh, I see where this comes from. So it's that type of, I think, that type of influence.
Yeah. Are there any physical movement practices that are practiced in Zen?
Well, the sitting on the cushion is actually a seated yogic posture. So there's that. There's also between the seated meditation sessions, and you asked this question at the very outset, and I haven't answered it yet. So generally 20 to 25 to maybe 40 minutes for a sitting period. It varies depending where you might be. And then depending how many sessions. Now, there's what's called a sesshin, which is a week-long meditation marathon, basically. You get up before dawn, you sit all day. There are work periods, there are meal periods, but basically you're sitting all day until maybe 9:30 at night, 10 o'clock at night. Maybe sitting all night. I mean, depending on how rigorous the sesshin is. But those are interspersed with walking meditation. So the walking meditation is essentially the same practice as the sitting meditation, except moving very slowly, being aware of the contact of your foot with the floor, and then after a certain number of minutes, 5 or 10 minutes, then speeding up and walking quickly, and then going back to the slow walk.
To see what the differences are?
Well, the differences are, for one thing, it helps to, in a very practical way, it helps to facilitate circulation after you've been sitting for a long time. And it also helps to moving from the slow meditation, which is still very, very focused, as I said, on the touching of the foot on the floor and being with the breath, When you speed that up, there's more of an exhilarating sense of still being totally present, but you really feel the powerful surge of that life force energy. And so it's the body practice of sitting on the cushion, the body practice of the walking meditation, and then often in various Zen centers there might be some maybe Tai Chi or maybe some Qigong or maybe some yogic practice incorporated into the schedule. Traditionally in China and Japan too, a lot of the martial arts were body practices that emerged out of these traditions. There are the traditional stories of the monks of Shaolin who were doing all kinds of martial art practice. When I was in Japan, I did some training in the traditional samurai iaido, which is the practice of drawing the sword, which nowadays is taught very much as a meditative practice. It's really about being completely present with all of the intricate movements that are involved in these skills. So yeah, there can be a lot of different bodily practices, and that's important because, as we're saying, the body-mind, again, just to repeat, is the site of awakening.
How influential were people like Musashi with like this kind of philosophy and martial arts? Did it come to him first, or was like he somebody who kind of like catalyzed this for others, or was it already kind of in the ether?
It was already kind of in the ether. That's a whole complex history, but yeah, it was. He certainly formalized it and helped to codify it, but there were multiple traditions coming into play from different sources, and that's a whole other topic in itself. But finding ways to utilize the body as either a defensive technique in warfare or as an aggressive combat technique when these monasteries needed to be defended from marauders and so on. There's a whole history to that, but it was basically in the ether.
What's the relationship in Zen between disciplined practice and spontaneity? Does that vary depending on the part of the country, or is that largely similar across schools?
I'd say it's similar across schools, and it's a crucial point. I'm glad you brought it up. So the discipline and the rigor is certainly basic. Zen, both Chan and Zen have been criticized historically by other Buddhist schools for being too demanding, too disciplined, too rigorous. They've been called the difficult path. And there's also a critique in saying that Chan and Zen emphasize what in Japanese is called chariki, which is self-power. So it's the paradoxical assumption that by using the discipline and rigor that I summon through my own will, through my own self, I can realize the experience of no self. And some of the other Buddhist schools in China and Japan were developed specifically to be what were called the easier paths, or the path of other power. Jariki, which is basically being able to surrender and hand your burden over to a salvific bodhisattva type deity. But that balance between discipline and spontaneity, I think, is really at the heart of Chan and Zen practice. And a lot of the koan training is really bringing that powerfully to bear, because it takes a lot of discipline and rigor to sit with a koan. And incidentally, going back to the technique of sitting, when you're doing koan training, you're basically sitting with the koan. So you let it permeate and you just stay with it. You roll it over, roll it over, roll it over. You think you see it. You go deeper. You present it. not in a way that is intellectual, but in a way that's spontaneous. So this discipline of sitting with the koan and then the spontaneous presentation of it really brings into sharp focus this balance, this middle way of discipline and spontaneity. And so many of the koans, the training is highly ordered, but they emphasize the spontaneity because it's one of those situations you think too much and you're lost. You have to respond in the moment. So that's highlighted over and over again.
Does the level of routine, does that vary between master and student? Like, is it more laid out for a student when they're first trying to figure this stuff out, and the master has it a little bit more loose because they've developed better judgment to be able to decide in the moment, or is it kind of the same between both?
In the koan presentation?
I guess just in general.
In general. I think it depends. I think it depends on the individual student and the individual teacher. What degree of latitude is being experienced in terms of relative looseness and relative stringence. And I think some teachers, especially the more traditional ones, really maintain that kind of stringent rigidity, and others will highlight more of the looseness and the free flow. So it really depends.
Is the Eightfold Path viewed as something to be deliberately followed, or is that viewed as something like followed as a guide, or is that viewed as something that kind of will naturally come about if you are able to maintain the right state of mind?
Well, I think both, actually. I think that's another excellent question. I think initially it functions as a guide, but more and more as it's incorporated, it becomes organic and it becomes a natural way to function in the world. Now, in Chan and in Zen, we don't train in the Eightfold Path specifically. Because it's part of our heritage, we're certainly familiar with it. But again, it does come from the Indian tradition, and once the Indian tradition arrived in China, it really modified enormously into something that was a hybrid in its own right. So the Eightfold Path, I think, tends to be surmounted by the ethical precepts as guidelines in Chan and Zen. But what I tend to teach and emphasize are what I call be clear, be kind, be present. I think that's all it is.
Yeah.
There's this enormous institutional structure that has developed over the centuries, which in many ways is quite beautiful and which I respect and honor. But really, it just comes down to be clear, be kind, be present. And so to get the clarity, I think the koan training really helps to facilitate that. It's clarity about the nature of reality, not being deluded. And then being kind is being free of selfishness, and the ethical precepts again give us guidelines for that. And being present, the meditation training helps us to learn how to be present without distractions. So it really just comes down to that.
Yeah.
And I'll just say that's my personal distillation of the Eightfold Path.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really love whenever things are like boiled down to just a few like key principles like that. For some reason, that's very appealing to me, which is I think probably why I'm so interested in Taoism and Zen, and for whatever reason why that resonates with me more, because I love that simplicity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do too. And it's not a reductionistic simplicity. It's, I know you're not implying this in any way. It's not a dumbing down. It's really a distilling. It's a distilling. And so, more and more, that's what I'm seeing, is that there's this enormous structure superimposed on what basically is just so simple. Be clear, be kind, be present.
Yeah, that reminds me of like the Ram Dass school is like that too, with
Hmm.
like the principles that came down from Neem Karoli Baba. It was just those few things, and
Hmm.
yeah, I do find sometimes like if I get too like overwhelmed with like too much instruction and detail for some reason that doesn't like sit right for me, and like I it tends to like I get I feel like my head gets more cluttered, and I kind of like miss the point.
Yeah, yeah, I know. I think some of these traditions do overthink it. Um, and I think also when you get down to the core of the mystical traditions of all religions, it's really about the direct experience of the sacred, and that's something that we all have as a birthright. So I'm certainly not a Zen or even more broadly a Buddhist chauvinist. I think there are all kinds of different spiritual traditions that get us to this same place of be clear, be kind, be present. And so we don't have to overthink it. It's right there.
Yeah. What's a daily life what's a day of practice for you like typically?
Well, these days, because I'm not living in, a standard practice setting like a Zen center or a monastery, which I did very briefly, so I know something of what that's like. But a typical day of practice for me, and in both Chan and Zen, we emphasize taking the practice off the cushion so that it's seamless practice. So what I'm endeavoring to do every moment of every day is just be fully awake to whatever it is I'm doing. So in a very mundane way, most days in the middle of the week, I'm online like this, or occasionally in person with Zen students or with spiritual guidance clients. And so I try to do a lot of deep listening with people. And then I don't see my role as giving answers. It's more a way of being a mentor and a guide, speaking from my own experience, because everybody has their own answers. Everybody already knows. The most I can do is sort of help them to see that. So a typical day will include that, and I live up here in the woods of Western Massachusetts. I'm usually outside in nature. I read a lot. I listen to music, a wide variety of music. Maybe see a movie or something, hang out with friends. A lot of it is, very typical of what other people would do. But I do try to bring to it a sense of taking nothing for granted.
How do you keep all of that from cluttering your mind and like keeping things like playing on repeat, just
Mhm.
thoughts over and over?
Yeah, well, at this point, I've been a Zen practitioner for over 30 years, so I don't really need to work at that anymore.
Yeah.
This isn't some kind of spiritual boasting or anything. It's just an observation that, over time, this practice really does kick in and have these benefits. It yields these results. I mean, it's been field tested by many people for centuries,
Mhm.
and by me as well. So I don't need to make a conscious effort anymore to cut that tape loop or get out of that incessant repetition of that monkey mind. Um, I'm usually able to just be, clear and present. I could probably work on being more kind sometimes.
We all
I,
could.
yeah, I could still use a little more of that. But I'm usually pretty clear and pretty present. But like anybody, sometimes something will run away with me, and I try to,
Yeah.
notice that pretty quickly, catch it, you know, get free of it.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap this up. Thanks a lot for coming back on. I love learning about this tradition so much. It's so interesting, as simple as it is. It's so interesting to try to practice and experience. So, yeah, thanks a lot for coming on to talk about this again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jake. It's always a pleasure. Every minute I really enjoy. So thank you so much.
Yeah, me too. Thanks.
Okay, great.